Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Let's start with a bit of user permissions. If you think about it, user permissions, it really kind of starts there with security, right? I mean, if we're thinking about employees and clients accessing your system, we want to be sure we know what we're giving them access to. So let's dive right into it. I want to kind of highlight a bit of what employee access there is, and maybe some highlights that you should just be aware of. So I'm going to start with just creating a simple employee user here. And for this, we're just going to type in Mr. John Doe, just give a fictitious email for now. One thing always just to note as a security measure as well, since we are on the topic of security, the company field is actually rather good to actually put in. This does help identify people a little easier. So when you're running audits, it may be easier if you have a department separate from just the organization you want to list here. It might be helpful when you're doing these audits and where John Doe works and obviously is doing most of what he's doing in ShareFile. So always good to kind of mention that in terms of the company field. Let's come down to user access. One thing to note right off the bat is you have some default permissions that are enabled. And I want to go through those first because I think these are really important to understand because people could just create employees and not think twice about this. So the first option is to create a root level folder in shared folders. That's the shared folders under the folder section there. That's where mainly you'll be creating folders to share out to people, or you're being added to folders that are created by other employees, such of that nature. You have use personal file box. Your file box also lives under the folder section. Think of that as a temporary space. When you're requesting a file, it will actually choose the file box by default unless you choose a separate shared folder or a personal folder. Also, this is reliant on using some of our applications like our Outlook plugin. You look at the little indicator on the right, it does mention that because what happens is when we're locally taking a file from our desktop per se, and we're creating a new email to send out with our plugin, that data needs to go somewhere in the share file first before we could share it. And that's where it resides for the time being in the file box. Just as a quick note as well, the file box is that temporary space. It does go based on a retention or 180 days by default. So you can move those files out to a permanent location or folder once it is uploaded to the file box itself. So just again, a little quick tip there. If you are on a premium user or license, you do have e-signature. By default, you get assigned a e-license signature license. You can disable that if you didn't want this user to actually have e-signature functionality. So that's something to consider as well. And then we have manage clients and then edit shared address book. One mention on the manage clients, I think that's really a kind of de facto where obviously you're working with external entities. You're creating a client, you need to create an entity for the person you're working with so you can add them to a folder, or if you're sharing a link that requires them to log in, it is mandated that they need to create clients. Now, aside from this, I really do feel that client management is really essential for employees. But if you want to take an extra step further, you can take this option out. And as an administrator, you can provision those clients ahead of time in bulk if you want to. So then your employees don't have the hassle to have to create clients. But then that kind of creates a loop where an employee would come to you as the administrator and ask you to create that client account. So just kind of be aware of some of those extra steps if you don't allow them to manage clients. And the shared address book is just that simple. It's just an address book that could be shared out. You can add certain favorite contacts to it so you can easily kind of dial them up if needed. So that is your basic employee user, right? That is somebody that is going to start working out, with these permissions. They can create the root level folders and kind of get to work. But let's take, for instance, if they need to be an actual administrator, what do we do there? We are set with a bunch of different permissions here, but there's nothing that says you're an administrator, right? There isn't any kind of particular policy or group that I can just put them in, per se. But for here, it goes based on the permission. So, for instance, let's just take some rudimentary level administrative tasks, right? First off, manage employees. That's pretty obvious, right? We are managing employees. That means you're actually taking consumption out of the license pool. So that is considered an administrative task. So we consider that once you actually have that check mark, that you're an administrator. Furthermore, which we're actually going to get to a little today, is managing the super user group. The super user group is that separate group outside of user permission that gives a user full access to all folders that live within ShareFile. So that is something very particular. You don't want to send out or give permission to everybody because then they would be able to edit and add additional people or take out people from the super user group. And again, we'll come back to that one because that's a very important topic. Aside from that, again, kind of going down the list here, as you start further kind of getting down the list, you'll kind of see that most of these do consist of more of administrative tasks. One I want to point out here is the configure single sign-on settings. One mention here I'd like to point out is this option actually gives you access to the whole security and login section under the settings and admins tab down here. That's very important because this doesn't just allow somebody to get single sign-on permission to make changes to single sign-on in the instance. This also grants them access to most of the security configurations within ShareFile. I did want to mention that because it doesn't really list it here, and that's something important that you should be aware of. Outside of that, just kind of be aware as you're kind of going through these options. You don't want to give just everybody and anyone these points of permissions. For instance, the billing capability of editing billing information and so forth, that should be reserved for somebody in your accounting department, somebody that is doing the actual license purchasing and handling the contracts and the billing of the company. You don't want to give that to everybody. Also, for instance, here down below, we have storage zones. Remember, storage zones is where your data resides. That's how we know where we need to go to get that data. We do have a hybrid model. You could use on premise, you could use cloud, but this is something very particular because you can change where data lies from editing user profiles and changing them to a different zone if they are available. So that is a lot more of the management side when it comes to where data resides. And again, you don't want to give that permission to just anybody. So all in all, again, through the permissions that we have listed here, just be cautious of when you're actually going through them. Most of these options are pretty straightforward. A lot of them also do provide a little bit of a tooltips. One other thing that I can mention here under the general option here is the access company account permissions. This doesn't necessarily give lots of information because there's a lot to it. Most of what we actually allow you to gain from this permission is more advanced configurations within ShareFile. We could probably spend a lot of time just talking about this one permission. But again, it's one permission that will actually provide a documentation after this webinar about this particular permission, because I do think it's essential understanding what configurations you have access to and where those options lie. But just all in all, think of this stats. I love to talk about this stats. This is one that kind of keeps coming up to me. There was a study from Beyond Trust that 36% of employees admit that they basically have more access to systems or data that they really shouldn't have in the first place. And it could be that they just don't say anything or they think they should have it, or maybe they just don't speak up. But that's a really high statistic. It's really high in I mean, 36% of employees think they have more access than they should. And just kind of think about that where obviously ShareFile could be storing quite a lot of data for you. And obviously when it comes down to it, things like being able to create root level folders and putting a ton of data in there that may not or shouldn't be in ShareFile in the first place is just one deterrent that we can actually turn off for an employee. But I think that's really essential when it comes to permissions. Think of that stat when you're thinking about adding users and giving permissions to employees. All right, so with that being said, I want to jump over to our super user group. Remember, we have our user permissions. This dictates what the user can do as an employee, a licensed employee within your ShareFile account. But there's one other special privilege that we can give a user, and that is the super user group. So under settings and admin settings, and security. And then you'll see down here, edit super user group. Remember that permission. Remember, we did have a specific permission called the manage super user group permission. We don't want to give that permission to everybody because then I would be able to access this just like I am and be able to add and take out people from this group. Now, again, just to detail what this does, again, this is a particular group within ShareFile that grants access to everyone in this group to all files and folders within ShareFile. So again, this is good for, say, people that are necessarily responsible for data and just protecting of data within an organization. Possibly again managers or people again responsible for just overall management of ShareFile. Those are the kind of people that would be in the super user group. So don't think right off the bat that if I made that one employee that we just made, John Doe, somebody as an administrator, they wouldn't automatically be added here to the super user group. I would have to manually add them in here. So just be aware of that. You will actually see the super user group by default pop up. So for example, if we go into one of our shared folders here and under the people tab, we'll see the super user group. That is on by default. I'm going to show you how we can hide that, but I just wanted to mention that because as you could see, they have all the permissions to the folder. Even if I was an owner, I wouldn't owner of the folder, I wouldn't be able to turn off these options. These are set in stone and cannot be changed. The only way we're going to take out anybody is from managing the super user group like we were just in. Let's come back over to there. And as you can see, we have our list. One thing I wanted to note is remember, like I said, I can hide that from showing under the folder. So I can simply hide that so that people aren't curious and start asking why the super user group is added to every one of their folders. So that's up to you in terms of hiding that. Just for curious people out there, you might want to hide it so there's no contention on why it's there. So simply put, I can continue to add people in here if I will. I can either just search from address book here, and if I wanted to, I can just check mark the ones I want and add them in. Or again, I can simply just remove them from here. As I mentioned, there is a little icon to the right of, say, my name because I am the account owner of the ShareFile instance. You can always come up to your admin review and actually see who the account owner is. That is me. There's only one account owner to a ShareFile account, so just to have a little tip there as well. And they're automatically, of course, added to the super user group by default because, of course, fail safe in that sense. If everyone was removed or no one was in there, and then, of course, everyone got removed from all the folders, I, as the account owner, would still be in here to be able to log in and access those folders if something was needing to be accessed or investigated in that manner. All right, let's move down a little further into our exploration into your security posture. So we talked a little bit about user permissions and also the super user group. Those are really good mentions here. But let's talk about the actual core functionality of ShareFile when we're actually sharing something or requesting a file from a client or another employee. I want to spend a little time in how we can lock down some of the capabilities and when we're creating a share. This is somewhat new. We've always had functionality where we could take out certain options when you're creating a share or a request link. But we've now implemented this so that you as an administrator can make those changes on the fly directly through your configuration interface here. So again, I went under advanced preferences and file settings. So you'll see at the top, we have our share settings. We'll hit these first. The first thing you'll see here is the grouping of different options and who I would be actually sharing this to. As you can see, the first two options are listed as anyone. And when we say anyone, we're referencing it to be anonymous, meaning we don't necessarily need anyone to log in to their account to ShareFile to be able to gain access to the shared documents that I'm giving them. Now, this could be good, this could be bad, depending on your situation and how you use ShareFile. That's very important to kind of start to digest here because obviously anonymous is unsecure. We don't have really any way to track the anonymous options when people are accessing that data. One caveat is on the anonymous one here, people do have to enter in a first name, last name, and email before they could access it. This doesn't necessarily create an account for them. It will generate an entity as a client on the back end so we can actually report on it. But the big thing there is there's no real validation that they're putting in accurate data into here. So just be curious of that. It could just be a good way just to take out the anonymous option and keep in the way that we're actually giving them access with the ability to put in some information there before they can access it. The two other options here have the ability for them to require to sign in first. Now, that requires that client to be enabled and activated already. There are methods to help facilitate the activation of that link before they can access it to create the account. But these are the most secure ways of actually having a more secure method of sharing, because then again, they would already have to have an account, or during the process of them getting shared that link, they would go through the activation process of the account. Furthermore, you do have some default capabilities here. So when I share a link, it would automatically go to the client employee user. So if maybe an employee isn't thinking twice, by default, it's set up already to go to this. So if they don't edit the share permissions, it's going to be right there for them. Same thing, also, we do have our Outlook plugin, so you can maneuver that a bit in terms of how you want to default it. And then also the big thing here is the maximum access expiration. This is when the link actually expires. So just be wary of that as well. We can set it, of course, a max expiration so that they couldn't go over that amount if they wanted to, or they couldn't actually set it to never. And finally, you have the rest for the request links. Remember this when I'm requesting files. This is when I'm sending something where they need to send something back to me when I create that link. Same options. And we wanted to separate that for simple purposes that uploading may be a little different. Maybe I don't really need to have them account because I'm just retrieving something from them. So again, something to consider there. Let's get also into some of the file sharing. As we just kind of went through this, I wanted to hit on one real key advantage here when we're sharing a file. We talked a little bit about creating that limited access. One thing I wanted to also bring up is the ability to encrypt sending of files via email. So one thing before I actually get into this, if you are thinking about actually using the encryption option, which actually encrypts the body of the message of the email I'm sending, which I'll show you briefly here, is be sure under the settings, admin settings, advanced preferences, and then email settings, you scroll down to the bottom and you do have enable encryption email on. Let's start and take one of our files, for example, and we want to share. Now remember, we're doing it through email, so it's the send to specific people. And then from there, as you can see, I can encrypt this email. What this does is, as you can see, it doesn't necessarily do anything right now to the screen. And by the way, your data is always at rest and in transit encrypted already. This is just adding an extra layer of encryption, which encrypts the body of the message here. So if I'm going to have a cryptic message that I need to send, or it's sensitive, I could put that in there, and I'll show you what it looks like when I send it to Mr. John Doe. Now, I already sent one to Mr. John Doe. Let me bring up his email. And when he gets it as a client, as you can see, he doesn't see the message in here. But if he clicks on the encrypted message, that's going to pop up. And as you can see, it decrypted the message that I sent him. So this is really handy if there's any particular information that needs to be even more secure about the file in question. But as you could see, it was client agreement that I needed to send him, and I could simply download that attachment directly. And the great thing about encrypted email is if there's something I need to send back to him in that same fashion, I could reply with the same message and attach files back to him. So again, it's a great way just to add a little bit of layer to securing that information when I'm sending it back and forth to each other. It just really, again, adds that extra layer of security. Don't think too much into it. Again, your data at rest and in transit is already encrypted. So that option, toggling it on or off, That's not going to change anything. The biggest thing it's going to change is the decrypting of the message. And as you could see, I don't have the normal way of just accessing it. I do have to log in. I do require to log into my John Doe account as a client to be able to retrieve that data. But this helps with, again, a more easier encrypted way of communicating back to, say, myself if I needed to give him a file back. My last topic before I move on and pass this over to Mr. Embry is social login. One thing I think that has come up a lot is how do I get my clients into my instance in an easier fashion, but keep it secure? We've made strides in this in providing social login. If you don't know what social login is, it's the capability of using or leveraging a different platform to authenticate you as a user and to say you are who you really are. For this matter, right now we do have Google available. So if you have a Google account and your client, say, wants to go through Google, maybe for security practices, they can leverage their Google account to actually authenticate into the ShareFile account. Mind you, I do have to save this. And once this is saved, this is enabling the platform to be able to do this. So, say for any new client that is being onboarded and activating their account, it's actually going to prompt them if they want to use Google, they can go through that process and it'll step them through. This won't change anything for existing clients. Existing clients would need to go under their personal settings. And in their personal settings, which I could actually show here, there will be a sign in section. And from there, they will see the Google option and then they could go through the process of enrolling it that way. So this is just, again, another kind of security consideration. If perhaps you want to lean on Google's authentication practices and you want the client to leverage that as well for more seamless interaction, definitely enable that, see how that goes. I do feel that is just a great way just to leverage if a client does feel more comfortable with authenticating with Google, more power to them. And I think it goes for a better user experience. So I am going to go hand this off to Mr. Embry. So Mr. Embry, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And I'm going to keep the conversation on client authentication or employee authentication just for a little bit longer as I talk through some of the other options that we have. So, as John mentioned, we do have the social sign in, as you can see here. But we also have standard ShareFile authentication, which has its own rules and things we can configure, as well as two-step verification. So in the section right above where you enable social sign-in, we have two-step verification. And what this allows you to do is if you're not using the social sign-in option, or if you're not using the single sign-on option, which I'll touch on here in a second, ShareFile will prompt your users, and you can choose if you apply this to client users or employee users or both. And essentially what will happen is when a user logs in, they will be prompted to do a second step of verification. So typically we'll see people just use a text message, but you can also do a voice call, or you can also apply it to like an authenticator app, and then you just type in the code from those authenticator apps. But this is something that I would say is a staple for ShareFile. As you can see here, it is enabled on your employee users by default, and you could extend this to your client users if your organization has a requirement where all users have to do two-step verification. Similarly, in the conversation of authentication, ShareFile does have password requirements that you can set. So if your organization has specific requirements on what a user's password must contain, whether it's a password length or it has to have a certain number of numbers or special characters. You can set those settings in ShareFile to mimic what your company's requirements are. You can set your password so that they expire after X number of days. So you could do like 90 days here. And then you can also set a number that your password can't match the X number of passwords that the user has used in the past. So just another way to do like the baseline of user security on your accounts, make sure that they have uh, strict passwords, make sure that they're not reusing passwords, things like that. And ShareFile will let you either configure that on or as a password requirement, or we can go into single sign-on. So another setting inside this login and security policy is single sign-on. Now, this is off by default, and not everybody has a single sign-on solution or an identity provider that they can integrate with. But if you do, ShareFile will likely be able to integrate with it, and there's likely already documentation that exists somewhere, either from the ShareFile side or from your identity provider, on how to configure SAML. It's pretty straightforward overall. You have to enable SAML, and then you basically just copy paste different settings from ShareFile into your identity provider, or from your identity provider back into ShareFile. So there's things like a certificate that you have to match. There's specific URLs that need to match between both systems. But once this is enabled, and if you force SSO on, so you can require that all your employee users must use single sign-on, when a user goes to your ShareFile account, they enter in their email address like they do today. And if you have SAML configured, ShareFile will automatically redirect those users to your identity provider for authentication. So you don't have to, like, it really doesn't change the ShareFile experience all that much. It's just you type in your email address, and if you have SAML configured and they're an employee user, they'll get redirected to your single sign-on provider. And if they're a client user, it's still the same process. They would just be prompted for either their social sign-in credentials or their ShareFile credentials. And then if you have the two-step verification on and they signed in with their ShareFile credentials, that would be a part of that authentication flow. Something else that's in here that's worth touching on before I move away is auto remediation. So what this is anything that happens on your ShareFile account is reported in some way, and I'll touch on reporting at the end of this. But the short of it is if a user is doing something that is uncharacteristic or impossible in some scenarios, then we can have things in place to automatically restrict their access so that you're not having to monitor anything, and it's something that just happens in the back end to make sure that your account stays safe without manual intervention. So the scenarios that we're looking for today, which are these three here, are for an event where you have an impossible traveler. So if a user is able to access from multiple countries in a quick period of time, so something where a actual user or a physical person couldn't travel to those locations at that time interval, then ShareFile will automatically flag that user, kick them out, and force a password reset so that they don't have access until they do like a manual, the user does a manual thing to regain access. Uh, Similar to the impossible traveler scenario, we also have a high download activity alert. So basically, ShareFile is just monitoring or has like a baseline of what your users are doing. And if a user does something uncharacteristic and starts downloading a whole bunch of data where they typically don't download a whole bunch of data, then you can have this auto remediation feature disable that user again. It doesn't disable the user, I'm sorry. It disables their access temporarily until they have to go through a process to regain access. And then close to the same as the Impossible Traveler, but just a little bit different because it doesn't look at physical locations. If a user is connecting from multiple different IP addresses in a short amount of time, typically that's something that we would see occur if a user is connecting from a proxy or trying to hide their internet traffic. Then they might be bouncing around logically between a bunch of different uh, internet addresses, we can call it. And if we detect that, right, we're just monitoring the number of IPs each user is connecting from. And if that number shoots up, then we can have auto remediation stop it, basically. And these are just things that you would turn on. And then in the event that one of these things happens, you'll get an alert, but you don't have to manually take action. Now, I've talked to customers where some of these settings they don't necessarily need to be on. Like maybe they have a user that from time to time gets a task where they have to download a bunch of the ShareFile data, but it's not something that they do frequently. It's just, every so often they have to go in and do it. So maybe they don't want the auto remediation for high activity or high download activity, something like that. So you can turn these on and off, and then it would be more of a you're notified, but nothing is happening automatically without you like directly making those changes to the account. And this kind of folds into another setting that we have. So this is the auto remediation, meaning that it's happening on its own. And then we also have security alert settings, which are just notifications of certain scenarios. And then this allows an admin to make a judgment call on a scenario. So the things that we're currently alerting for are a user signs in from a different country. And now, again, these aren't preventing access in any way. They're just notifications to an administrator. And this is what these little checkboxes are. So notification to an administrator would be this first checkbox. If you also want to alert the employee user doing the action, if it's an employee user, you can have that selected. And then you have a client user. So if this is happening to a client, you can also alert the client via email. And you can also add another administration's or administrator's email address so that if you want multiple people to be notified, multiple admins to be notified of these events, you can add like a distribution group in here or add a junior admin, something like that, where they can go and reach out and figure out what's going on with these users. So the events that we're tracking are a user signs in from a different country. So maybe you just want to be alerted. Like typically, this user is connecting from the United States and then they connect from somewhere in Europe. Now, maybe that user is traveling, but it's worth just having a notification to say, like, all right, let me reach out to the user, make sure they're traveling, make sure that this is actually them accessing the account. And if you don't want the users, again, to be notified, you can just check these off so that like if a client user is traveling, maybe your clients don't have long-term access to content, so that's not that important to you. But it gives you the time to, like an admin, the time to go look and figure out what's this user doing, check on the user, etc. Similar to a different country, we also have a different city using a different device. So this would be just a net new device and a net new location, still within the country. Do you want to be alerted to that? And again, this kind of goes into what are your users' use cases? Do they use multiple devices? Do they have a work laptop and then they're using a company device like a phone? And that's just multiple locations, or it could be multiple locations with multiple devices. So depending on if this applies to you or not, would dictate whether or not you need to have these on or off. Uh, Multiple sign-ins or failed sign-ins on a user's account. I think this one's pretty important for everyone to be alerted on. And this could be, I like this one because there's different scenarios, right? This could be a scenario where a user just forgot their password. Now, an admin could get ahead of a ticket that gets created or get ahead of an email by seeing the alert from multiple sign in requests and saying, like, okay, let me reach out to this user and make sure that they have the correct credentials to access ShareFile. But also, it could be a brute force attack where somebody is trying to use common passwords to gain access to your account, which kind of goes back to those password requirements, just making sure that the passwords that you're requiring your users to have aren't generic, like password 123 kind of passwords. Um, and then the last one here is a suspicious file is uploaded to a folder. Now, when any of these occur, like I said, you are alerted. That's the intent here is just a security alert. And what that looks like, whether it is a suspicious file or a failed sign in or any of these, it looks something like this. So this is one that I did earlier. So this is the email from ShareFile where it says, what's the account? So this is the account that I'm using. The user's name is client last. It's my Gmail account. It'll show location and device and then the time that it occurs. And then it gives you a link to go review that user's activity. So you'll get a security alert for these events. And Also, if you go to the user itself, so that user was a client user, which was this person right here, it'll display this security alert when you're just looking at the browse clients option. And if you go into the user, you have activity and security alerts, which will let you see what was flagged. So on this account, I did access from an unusual location last month, and then recently I did the multiple failed login attempts. Now, here I can choose what actions I want to take. So the auto remediation would do certain actions automatically, but these options are more of a manual process for an admin to take at their discretion. So I could disable access. Let's say I got these notifications on a Friday afternoon. Maybe I'm just going to disable access until Monday where I can take the time to figure it out. Or maybe it's a weekend and I don't want to have to deal with it on the weekend. You could disable access. That user will immediately lose access to all things ShareFile, and then you could figure it out and enable access later. If it is something like that, multiple failed login attempts where the user just might not know their credentials, you can also trigger a password reset from here. So pretty straightforward on your options and what you can do when you get one of these alerts, and it's just a helpful way to make sure that your users are doing things that they're supposed to do. And then in the event where you get one of these alerts, you know how to take action. The last one, just because it's here in the list and it's easy to talk about, is a suspicious file is uploaded. So anything that gets uploaded to your ShareFile account is scanned for malicious content. Now, if somebody uploads something malicious, similar to that security alert email that I showed you a couple of seconds ago, we also have one for we detected suspicious files. So in the event that this happens, you get a notification saying this is the folder that it was in, this is the file that it occurred, this is the time, this is the user that uploaded it, and then you can go and view that folder directly. Now, inside of the folder itself, there's a couple different ways to show this. Inside the folder itself, there'll be an icon that I can touch on, but there's also this quarantine files section that'll show you all the quarantined files on the account, and you can select that file and you can restore it if it's not malicious. You can just fully delete it, or you can download it, and then maybe you have additional scans locally that you want to run on it, or you want to send it to your IT team, something like that. Um, this kind of gives you that control as an administrator on what you want to do. And then on the file itself, so this one is in my file box, you get this little icon here that shows that there's a warning on it. And if you try to download this file, it will throw a warning here saying that we detect something bad on this account. This is just a test file, so no harm here, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what that looks like and kind of what ShareFile is doing to make sure that the content of ShareFile remains safe. Something else that kind of goes in line with the ability to like scan content from malicious files is the ability to scan content for PII. So now this isn't necessarily keeping your account safe, it's more keeping your users' information safe or your client's information safe based off the data in the file itself. So if I go into ShareFile and I'm just going to share a file this way and I click Browse Files and I'm going to send from my computer, I'm going to upload a sample PII file. Oops. And because of my account's settings, this is by default going to require my users to sign in order to download the content. Now, what John mentioned earlier is on an account or on a share link, you can change who can access the link. So you could change this to anyone, meaning anonymous, or that name and email option where they can just put in any information. And if you do that, and this is going to happen quickly, so I'm going to try to preface what's going to happen, and then hopefully it'll show. So if you change this to anyone, ShareFile is going to scan the content of the file to say, is this something that we think is safe that doesn't contain any personal identifiable information? And if it does contain information, we're going to throw a little warning that says, hey, maybe you shouldn't share this anonymously. So I'm going to click this, and then you'll see it happen pretty quickly. So there's the analyzing file content, and then this file contains sensitive information. This particular file just has a bunch of different types of information in it, but this is the things that we're scanning for. So basically anything identifiable, location information, banking information, social security numbers, things like that. And then if we detect it, we're saying, hey, anyone can download this. You should probably apply our recommended settings. And the recommended settings will be the users have to sign in order to access it. So that's just another way that ShareFile is making sure that your content that you're sharing is safe. The malicious scanning is making sure that the content that is in your account is safe. And then the reporting is making sure that everything that happens on the account has a proper auditing trail. So inside of settings, admin settings, underneath company account info, we have various types of reports that you can run on an account. You go up here into the top right and click create report. And these are the different types of reporting that you can run to pull an audit on either your entire account, on a particular user, on a particular folder, just to figure out what's happening. So we have a usage report, which is the most common. I'll go into that one in a second, where it shows you all activity on the account. So any uploads, downloads, login attempts, login failures, things like that will be in the usage report. The access report is who has access to what. So if you want to know how many of your client users have access to particular folders, you can run an access report to gain that information. And then you can run an access change report to see the change of who got added, when they got added. If permissions are changing in any way, it'll get logged in access change. We then have a couple of storage reports. So if you just want to know more information about the data on your account, that's what those two are used for. Then we have the ability to pull anything that's shared on the account. So if people are sharing content via links, like I just showed, or via emails, like an encrypted email, something like that, you'd be able to see any of those share links that are created. And same with requesting links. It's just ways to pull all content on the account. And then the last one I'll touch on here is just pulling users on your account. So if you want to know a full list of all your client users as well as your employee licensed users, you can pull a user report, and this will show you a ton of helpful information. It'll show you last login, who created the user. So if you want to like isolate like stagnant licenses or users that aren't using the product as much as they should be, you can run a user report and then go after those users and say like, hey, how are you sending your content? But the usage report, as I mentioned up here at the top, is by far the most common, and this lets you run activity on all things on the account. So if you want to see every login failure, every upload download, that's here. And you can also set these to be recurring. So I could run this in a one-off on a specific user or a specific folder, as I mentioned, or run it on the entire account. But then you can set these to run, and you can set this to run for certain time frames. So you can run it all the way back to the dawn of the account's creation, but you have to run it in 90-day blocks because sometimes these reports will get massive. So we limit it to 90 days so that we can kind of keep them under control. But if you're running recurring reports, you can set this at whatever time frame you want, and then you'll select a location for these to get saved, and then you select how often it runs. So if I set it to run for a 7-day window, I can set that to run every week, and then it'll run every week for that 7-day window. So all in all, that covers the security features that I wanted to walk through today. And lastly, I just want to call out that if you do want to talk with someone like John or myself, maybe you have some questions about a particular feature, or you just want to have like a session where we can go back and forth and answer anything that you bring up, or show you any new features that we didn't cover today. If you go down to the bottom right hand corner on your account, you'll have this little icon down here, and you can click Contact Success Engineer. And in this case, this one's me, but it'll be mapped to your dedicated success engineer. And you can just click Let's Connect, and you can start a conversation essentially immediately. It'll send us an email, and then we can just reach back out via email. There's also a way to schedule time. So if you do have questions and you're looking for some assistance, reach out to us and we'll get you squared away.